At 66, I watched my home burn while my son texted, "Don't come here." Hours later, I stood at his red door with nothing but a smoke-soaked purse and hope he'd remember my face. He smiled like a polite stranger, said he needed peace, and shut the door before the neighbors could pity me. That night, in a motel that smelled of bleach and loneliness, I called the one man I thought I'd lost forever, and his 3 words changed everything. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. At 66, I learned that fire not only eats wood and paint, it exposes hearts. Heat rose through the hallway like breath from an animal, steady and hot. The living room hummed with a low crackle that became a roar, and the sky outside turned the color of oranges left too long in the Sunday. I moved the way you move when your body decides before your mind, past the bookshelf where I kept the birthday cards and recipes, past the armchair that still remembered the shape of my husband. The smoke was thicker near the ceiling, and the air tasted like pennies. Sirens were distant, then closer, then everywhere. When I reached the kitchen, I grabbed the purse on the table, and the keys inside made a small, hopeful sound. The back door handle was hot enough to warn me, but not enough to keep me. I stepped out into the night that glowed as if someone had poured light into the street. Mrs. Doyle from next door was already outside in her robe and garden clogs, one hand holding her phone and the other pressed to her heart. She kept saying my name as if that could slow the heat. She told me to get away and that there was nothing left to save. I told her that was what she thought, and I did not raise my voice because I had no voice to raise. A window broke with a sound like a plate falling on tile. The fire truck pulled up, and the men moved with a careful speed that looked like practice. Water met heat, and the air hissed. On the lawn, my breath finally caught up with me. I stood there with my purse and the thin sweater I had thrown on, and I watched the place where my life had been become something else. Time does something strange when you cannot go back inside. Minutes insist on being hours. I noticed things I had never noticed. The way the old oak leaned toward the roof as if listening. The way the porch light, stubborn and small, kept burning until the wires surrendered and it flickered out like a tired eye. I saw the framed photograph of my husband through the window for a moment before the living room filled with gray, and then I saw only half of his face, the other half blackened to a shape I could not read. My hand lifted on its own and then lowered. I did not cry. My body was saving water for later. The firefighters asked questions. I answered them in the smaller voice I use when I try to relax a child. They went about their work and checked my hands for burns and said I was lucky. Lucky is a word people use when they need a lid to put on a disaster. I nodded. In the edges of all that noise, I heard another sound. Silence. I realized the alarm never screamed. It had chirped for weeks and then stopped. I remembered Ethan on a Sunday afternoon with a chair dragged under the ceiling, the cheap battery between his fingers. He had told me it was just for a minute while he checked the wiring. I had said I would remind him to put it back. I never did. Memory can be a small, cruel thing that arrives exactly when the heat is highest. I closed my eyes until the picture of his hands faded. When the hoses finally slept and the glow dimmed to a low, stubborn burn, I walked the length of the sidewalk and back. The night had a new smell, not the salt and sweet I knew from summer storms in Savannah, but the flat scent of wet wood and old electricity. The Red Cross volunteer asked if there was anyone I could call. I said to my son. She looked relieved in the way people do when the burden can be passed to a word like family. Ethan lived 20 minutes away on a street where the grass made a line as straight as a ruler. I called from Mrs. Doyle's phone. He said, "Come." I said I would. I thanked the volunteer and walked to a car I did not own. Mrs. Doyle put her warm hand around my wrist for 1 second, as if passing a secret back, and then let go. The ride to Ethan's house felt like crossing a state line without luggage. My driver spoke kindly, and then did not speak at all, which was kinder. I watched streetlights waver on the windshield and thought about the morning routine that would not happen. The black coffee, the small radio, the first bird. At the red door, I lifted my hand and knocked. Through the glass, I saw the wide hallway lined with framed travel photographs I had never stood in front of. Ethan opened the door, and I saw my own jaw on his face and my husband's eyes. For a moment, this made me feel steady. Then Clara appeared by his shoulder, and steadiness left like a tide. They both smelled like sleep and detergent. He took the suitcase from my hand and set it down with care that did not feel welcome. He said words about privacy and balance and the rhythm of their life. She spoke softly about space and how families can love each other without sharing a roof. I thought of roofs and how weak they are if trust is missing. I stood on the threshold and tried not to look like rain at their wedding. I said I would keep to myself and that this was only for a little while. Clara's eyes were kind and firm in the same second. Ethan looked down as if reading something. He told me the guest room was full of boxes, that they had just painted, and that the timing was difficult. He said they would help with a hotel. He reached for his wallet the way you reach for a tissue. He lifted the suitcase again and set it near my shoes, and I understood the conversation was already over. He closed the door softly so the neighbors would not hear. The motel sign at the highway exit was half lit. The room held its breath in that way rooms do when no one has claimed them. The air moved with the low hum of a machine that worked very hard to be unnoticed. I sat on the bed and placed the purse beside me, and the purse made a dark mark on the cover where the smoke had stained it. I opened it and counted the things that had come with me without thinking. Keys that no longer belonged to anything. A comb with 3 teeth missing. A folded receipt with a note from a day that now belonged to a world before orange skies. I closed my eyes and saw the photograph again. One eye gone, one eye watching. The shower water turned my skin pink and washed the ash into a small gray pool near the drain. When I lay down, I did not sleep. The mind does not like to be told to turn off. I thought of Ethan as a child who collected stones and told me their stories. I thought of the Sunday afternoons when Clara would come by with baked ziti, and we would eat in the kitchen, and she would speak about yoga and boundaries and breath. Boundaries are a word that can hold kindness if you let it. It can also be offense. I stared at the ceiling and listened to the thin hiss of the lamp. Something about that sound made me reach for my wallet again, for the small sleeve where I kept old photographs and one other thing I had never thrown away. A man once gave me a number on the back of a recipe card. He told me to keep it in case life did not do what we asked. I had carried it like a pebble at the bottom of a river. I dialed with hands that did not feel like mine. One ring and then another, and then a click that sounded like a door not closing but opening. The voice on the other end was deeper than it used to be, and the same. He said my name before I offered it. He said it as if he had been practicing in a quiet room. He told me something simple and impossible. He told me you are home. For a long breath, I could not find words. Then I told him where I was. I told him about the orange sky and the red door and the soft click that keeps mothers on porches. He said he was already driving. Outside the window, the highway kept its rhythm. In the lot below, a silver car turned under the dead half of the sign and idled. I stood up, and the bed lifted its weight as if relieved. I took the purse and the key and one long breath. The rain began the way forgiveness does. Slowly at first, then enough to make a sound you can follow. I walked out into it and let it lay cool hands on my face. Somewhere behind me, water still hissed at the heat, and somewhere ahead, a porch light would be on for the first time in years. I thought about that photograph with half a face. I thought about the other half that was never printed. I kept walking. Composure can be a shelter when houses fail. Tonight, it was the only shelter I had, and it was enough to carry me to the curb where the car waited, and to the voice that had remembered me when I had almost forgotten myself. Some doors do not need locks. The silence behind them is enough. The red paint looked new under the porch light, the kind of cheerful shade Clara would choose for spring photographs. It had a brass knocker shaped like a laurel leaf, and a faint spray of lemon cleaner clung to the air around it as if the wood itself had a skincare routine. I stood there with my purse pressed against my ribs and listened to the quiet inside their immaculate house. A dishwasher clicked somewhere in the back like a metronome counting down to something I could not delay. My breath fogged the glass panel. I wiped it with the back of my hand and knocked. Ethan opened the door with that careful expression he learned from me when he was small and skinned his knees in the driveway. He had my jawline and his father's eyes, wide and gray, steady when there was a problem to solve. His t-shirt was soft and expensive, and his hair smelled like eucalyptus. For a moment, the hallway behind him blurred, and I saw a smaller boy with a science fair poster board under his arm and a grin made of gap teeth. The poster board vanished. Clara appeared at his shoulder, wearing bare feet and a silk top the color of cream. She carried a wine glass by the stem, not drinking, just holding it like punctuation. The air inside was cool and organized. A refrigerator motor purred. Somewhere a dryer hummed. The soundscape of a life that had found its rhythm and did not plan to be interrupted. Ethan stepped back half an inch, and I stepped forward half an inch, and we stayed in that measured space like dancers who did not remember the steps. He took the suitcase from my hand. He set it down near the entry table where a bowl of smooth gray stones waited for keys. He did not put my keys in the bowl. "You are all right?" he asked, and his voice was low like a library. I nodded. He glanced at the purse. He glanced at my shoes, which did not match my coat. He did not glance at the smoke that clung to my hair the way grief clings to a widow at the end of a long line of condolences. Clara touched his arm with 2 fingers and looked at me over his shoulder. "We love you, but we need balance." She said it like a therapist handing over a useful word. "We have worked very hard to make this home peaceful, and this is a delicate time for us." I was quiet long enough to hear the dishwasher change cycles. "Balance sounds a lot like distance," I said. She smiled. The smile was warm and stainless. It had been practiced for the company. Ethan lifted my suitcase to test the weight. "We just painted the guest room last week," he said. "There are boxes everywhere." He looked at the floor when he said boxes, as if the word might trip him. "Mom, it is just complicated. The house appointments and the wedding plans work. We did not expect." He let the sentence trail off like a ribbon, pretty and useless. I watched his throat work. I watched the way his heartbeat showed under the thin blue of his t-shirt. I thought of the Sunday he moved out, the way he left a single sneaker with a dried mud crescent near the heel, as if some part of him had intended to return and then forgot. The light over the entry table was the same soft glow he had picked out of a catalog with me when he was 12 and wanted a reading lamp he could call his own. The lamp now belonged to the entry of a life where I did not fit. Clara breathed in and set down her wine glass on a coaster of woven grass. "There are extended stay places near the mall," she said. "They are safe and very clean, and you would have your own little kitchen. You could take a breath and figure out what you want next. For our happiness and yours, it is better to keep our spaces clear." She tilted her head in a show of care, and her earrings shivered in the light. For a second, I felt my body want to fall backward into the familiarity of old rules. Mothers make room. Mothers take less. Mothers do not stand in doorways and teach their children what absence feels like. I kept my feet where they were. I turned to the left and saw their gallery wall. Travel photographs in black frames, oceans and alleyways and atriums, 2 people laughing at corners of the world where I had never been. I counted frames until the need to count passed. "I will not be in your way," I said. My voice was the voice I saved for thunderstorms that scared Ethan when he was 6. "I will cook. I will keep quiet. I will make the bed every morning the way you prefer." Clara touched her own throat as if loosening an invisible scarf. "It is not about chores, Marjorie. It is about energy. This home has a tone. We are still learning how to hold it." That sentence was elegant and unnecessary, like a ribbon on an already closed box. Ethan reached for his wallet and did not quite take it out. "We can help with a room for a few nights," he said, "just until—" He stopped there and looked at me the way he used to look at the sky when a storm sat just outside town, ready and not ready. I looked at his hand on the suitcase handle. The knuckles were the same shape they had been when he gripped a crayon and drew a red door on notebook paper and labeled it home. He had drawn a window with 4 panes. In one pane he had drawn me waving. "You are kind," I said, and I meant it. Kindness is not the same as welcome. He knew that, but could not say it out loud. The hallway smelled like laundry and lemon, and something faintly metallic I could not identify. Maybe it was the hinges. Maybe it was the part of a house that knows when an old language is not being spoken anymore. Clara moved to the side, and the motion pulled my eyes to the kitchen. I saw a bowl of fruit lined up by size and color. I saw an empty corkboard and a tidy schedule magnet. I saw a pair of running shoes turn soles up to dry. The everyday trophies of people who intend to live a long, organized life. Your therapist would be proud, I thought, and then I felt the little sting of that thought and let it dissolve. There was nothing to win here. There was only the fact that I had arrived at a threshold and been asked to keep it clean by not crossing it. I bent for the suitcase handle. Ethan bent at the same time, and our fingers brushed the rubber. His skin was warm, and my skin was cool, and we both flinched like people meeting an old photograph in a thrift store. He cleared his throat. "Call me when you are settled. I will check on you tomorrow." His eyes moved past me to the dark street. He was already imagining me somewhere else. It made his shoulders relax. Clara stepped forward, and the perfume that lived in her collarbone touched the space between us. Her voice softened. "Please know this is about health, not rejection. We will help with costs. We will visit. We will make sure you have what you need." Her sentences were blankets laid carefully on a couch that no one was allowed to sit on. I straightened, and the purse strap slid down my arm and landed in my palm with more weight than its contents deserved. I looked at the red paint one last time. It really was a good color. Alive. Festive. It would photograph beautifully when they stood here after the wedding with confetti in their hair. The brass knocker gleamed like a medal pinned to the chest of a soldier who never saw battle. I placed my hand briefly on the wood and felt nothing, not even warmth borrowed from the house. "Thank you," I said. The words tasted clean. I stepped back onto the welcome mat, a rectangle that meant its promise for everyone but me. Ethan lifted the suitcase across the threshold and set it beside my shoes. His fingers tightened and loosened like he wanted to apologize, but had to locate the right word and could not. He looked up. I saw my own stubbornness in his face. It used to comfort me that he had inherited it. Tonight it simply meant we would both stand by decisions. He eased the door until the latch kissed the frame. The hinge sang a thin metallic note that seemed to go on longer than it should have, like a breath held past comfort. The dishwasher clicked again, and drowned under the soft final sound of the latch catching. Through the glass I watched their shadows move back into the house. The hallway light dimmed. The red surface went matte under the porch lamp. I could see my own outline reflected there for a moment. A woman carrying a purse that smelled like smoke, and a small suitcase with one wheel that stuck. I took the handle and pulled. The wheel hiccuped at the seam between porch and path, and then found its glide. The night air held a dampness that promised rain by morning. The neighborhood was so quiet I could hear my breath and the faint clack of the suitcase over the seams in the concrete. A dog barked 2 houses down and then remembered not to. I kept my eyes on the sidewalk and counted each square until the counting no longer served me. At the end of the street, the entryway lights grew sparse. I turned left toward the sound of distant traffic and a motel that did not ask for balance or tone. The hinge song still hung in my ear like a polite goodbye that forgot how to come back. In the flicker of a motel light, I realized survival has no dignity, but it has purpose. The Ocean View sign buzzed like an insect, half the letters fading and returning in a tired rhythm. The lobby smelled of detergent and old air that had learned every story by heart. A ceiling fan turned with the patience of someone counting to 10. The clerk slid a plastic fob across the counter, blue with white numbers. Room 214. The tag was shaped like a teardrop. It swung once on the key ring and stilled as if bracing for my hand. He asked how long I would be staying, and I listened to my own breath before I answered, just until I remember where home is. He stared as if the question had moved to the wrong side of the counter. Then he nodded and pushed a registration card toward me, while a small radio behind him whispered a song from a decade that had been kinder to my knees. The hallway held a thin ribbon of salt air that had slipped in through the seams. I carried the suitcase by its stubborn handle and let the wheels complain only when the carpet changed to tile and back again. When I found the number on the frame, I paused at the threshold. The light inside waited with the patient hum of an appliance working without praise. I tapped the fob against my palm and thought of all the rooms I had entered in my life, all the rooms I had left. "You have survived worse, have you not?" My voice was quiet enough to hear the answer. I turned the key and stepped inside. The room did what rooms do when no one has asked anything of them yet. It held itself together. Thin curtains moved, a modest sway, as if trying on the idea of wind. The unit under the window breathed in steady intervals. On the bedside table sat a little triangle of folded paper with a list of restaurants no one had recommended to someone they loved. I set the purse down, and the strap left a faint, darker line against the spread that would outlast me by a day. I placed the key fob on top of the phone. The number faced up like a reminder that temporary can also be a compass. I opened the drawer and found a paper notepad with the motel's name printed at the top in a font that seemed embarrassed to exist. I turned on the tap in the bathroom and let it run until the water lost the taste of metal. My reflection in the narrow mirror did not surprise me. There are nights when surprise is a luxury. I washed my hands with soap that reminded me of lemon without ever having known a tree. I stood in the soft hiss of the fan and counted to 30. When I came back to the bed, I brought the purse with me and placed it in my lap like a sleeping animal that had finally trusted itself to rest. The wallet was singed at one corner from the heat that had followed me down the hallway of my house. The leather had tightened in a way that suggested it was trying to be smaller than events. Inside, the bills were in no hurry to be anything. I lifted the small sleeve I had not opened in years. Out slid a photograph, the size of my palm, edges worn to softness like sea glass. 2 people in their 20s sat on the hood of a borrowed car. The sky behind them looked like it still believed in people. The girl had her hair tucked under a scarf she had sworn she would never wear again. The boy had a grin that belonged to sunlight. On the back, written in a hand that made even the letters look brave, were 4 words. "Do not forget, T." The ink had not faded in any important way. My body made a shape I had not made in years, the sort of protective curve an animal makes when the weather is too much of anything. Thomas Whitaker. He had been 27 and impossible. I had been 26, and certain that certainty was a kind of map. He had left a number on the back of a recipe card because recipes are for the things you mean to do again. He had said, "Keep it, just in case life does not do what we ask." I had kept it because a corner of my heart likes to pack a small bag and slip it into the trunk. I held the picture at arm's length, the way a doctor holds an X-ray to a light, and tried to see where the break began. The ocean was somewhere behind us that day because the edges of the photograph smelled faintly of salt if I let memory do its work. We had driven to a high place outside town in a truck borrowed from a cousin who believed in us more than we believed in ourselves. He had said the city looks honest from up here. He had said the porch lights make a language at night. He had said sometimes all you need is a line to follow home. I had told him that lines can't tangle. He had said then you untangle them together. His hands on the wheel were steady in a way I have loved all my life. When he walked me to my stoop, he tapped the recipe card once for luck and told me to tuck it where important things go. He had kissed my forehead in a way that belongs to men who mean their promises. I pressed the photo to my chest and heard the room breathe around me. The unit under the window exhaled. The curtain tried and failed to touch the sill. The radio in the lobby drifted down the hall when a door opened and closed somewhere far away. My phone lay beside the key fob with its little teardrop certainty. Earlier, I had dialed a number I had honed to a superstition. The voice that answered had been deeper and familiar in the same instant. He had said 3 words that rearranged the furniture of my chest. He had asked where I was, and he had not waited for my shame to finish its sentence before he said that he was already driving. I did not know the color of his car anymore. I did not know if he still drank his coffee black. I knew the shape of his kindness, and that was enough to stand up. I placed the photograph back in the sleeve and the sleeve back in the wallet and the wallet back in the purse, as if reversing small pieces of time could rehearse a larger miracle. I drew the curtains and found that night here was not the same kind of night that had followed me from the other place. Night here had made peace with neon and tires and the distant bell of a buoy that I could almost pretend to hear. I slipped off my shoes and set them side by side like a promise to my own feet. I stretched out on the bed and watched the ceiling shadow breathe with the unit's quiet devotion. A woman in the room above me walked from one end to the other, and then back again. I pictured her in a robe with damp hair and a towel around her shoulders. I wished her a dream that did not require effort. The radio song found my ears again. Somewhere Only We Know. I let the melody lie down with me and look at the ceiling too. I wondered if Thomas had ever danced in his kitchen when nobody watched. I wondered if he still kept a plant alive on a windowsill just to prove he could. The key fob glinted under the lamp, as if it disliked being ignored. I thought about how a temporary key can be a doorway into a permanent decision. I thought about the way people talk about dignity as if it lives in furniture and clothing, and not in the art of taking the next breath while your past refuses to sit still. The unit under the window clicked and rested. The quiet that followed was not the kind that punished. It was the kind that let you hear your own pulse and consider it trustworthy. I closed my eyes and saw the photograph again. The sky, the borrowed car, the grin. I felt the weight of the purse at my hip like a loyal dog. I listened for the sound of tires on wet pavement and headlights folding themselves across a parking space that had not been expected to be chosen. If he did not come, I would still wake up. If he did, I would still be myself. In that clearing between fear and hope, I let the song carry me for a minute. The radio sounded like someone humming in the next room. The night tasted like salt and lemon and something else I could not name yet, something that felt like the beginning of a map. 40 years of silence ended with a single word, hello. The line rang once, then twice, then into a space where I could hear the sound of my own heartbeat. I pressed the phone hard enough to feel the small ridge on the case. The radio down the hall breathed a familiar melody and then gave it back to quiet. On the third ring, he answered. He did not ask who was calling. He said hello as if he had been expecting the exact weight of my breath. "It is me," I said, and I heard the tremor sit down inside the sentence. He did not pause to translate. "It always was," he said. Then he said my name the way you say a word you keep safe on a high shelf. "Marjorie." There are moments when the body learns a new rule. Mine learned that shame can loosen its grip if someone recognizes you without inventory. I tried to explain all at once. The fire, the orange sky, the red paint, the soft click that told me I would sleep somewhere that did not know my snore. I tripped over the order of events and gave up on order. He let the silence between us do the stitching. I could hear him standing up from a chair. I could hear keys kiss his palm. "Tell me where you are," he said. I told him the name on the fob and the number on it as if reading coordinates from the corner of a map. He said, "I know it." He said, "Do not hang up." He said, "I am on my way." The words did not feel like rescue. They felt like someone opening a window in a room that had forgotten its latch. I listened because that was all I could do, that did not require permission. I heard the shudder of an elevator door. I heard footsteps that I knew were going. He spoke once to someone, and his voice took on the polite firmness of a man accustomed to being believed. The echo shifted, and he was in a garage. There was the soft click of a fob, and the answer of a car waking up. The engine turned with the confidence of a creature that has never missed a meal. "Stay with me," he said, and the phrase was not a command but a bridge. "Do you still drink your coffee black?" I asked for no good reason except that the past sometimes needs a small proof of life. He always said, and I imagined the way he used to wrap both hands around a cup as if heat were a story you could hold. "Do you still keep a plant on the window?" I asked, because questions are gentler than thoughts. He laughed the same quiet laugh he had when we were young and overly sure. 3, in fact, he said, and I realized there was a joy inside that number. Some things do learn to keep growing. The road announced itself in a change of sound. Tires found their rhythm. A turn signal ticked like a metronome. Wiper blades tested the air and decided against duty. He asked if I was alone. I said yes in the way a person says yes when the word is accurate but not complete. He did not fill the space with pity. He said I would be there, and the sentence carried a steadiness I could lean against without bending it. I remembered a different phone in a different year. A spiral cord that twisted while I twined it around my finger and spoke into a receiver that clicked with every heartbeat. He had called after an interview in a city we both pretended was not far. He had said the skyline makes a promise at dusk. He had said come see. I had said I would when time made room. Time never did. Tonight, time made a small bright clearing and then stood back like a teacher who has finally learned how to stop talking. There was a sound like a coat sleeve brushing leather. Turn by turn, he narrated without meaning to. Merging now, past the stadium. "I am taking the coastal road." The words were not for me to memorize. They were a way to keep the air between us warm. The radio in his car whispered the end of a newscast and offered the weather. Chance of rain before morning. "Good," I said, and I meant it. Rain takes the sharp edge off anything too bright for too long. He asked me about my hands. "Are they steady?" I looked at my fingers and noticed the faint tremor stitching its way along the vein under the skin. "They are holding," I said. He said that was all they were required to do tonight. I told him what I had not told anyone, that the quiet hurt more than the heat, that a soft voice can be sharper than steel if it carries the word boundary in the wrong place, that I had seen half of my husband's face through the glass before the color took it. He let each sentence land and rest. He did not tidy them into wisdom. He asked me if I was hungry. The question reached across a gap I had not known how to cross. I said not yet. He said, "Then we will try later." He said, "Your voice is the same." I said it cannot be. He said the way you unclench on the second breath has not changed. The way you end a sentence when it matters by softening the last word has not changed. The way you say my name, as if you are giving me back to myself, has not changed. I let that last line sit where he put it. The car hummed like a deep instrument. He accelerated in a way that did not apologize to the night. We spoke about things that could occupy the road between us without crowding it. a cousin who used to lend us a truck, a hill outside town that made the city lights look like patient constellations, a porch swing that had taught us the mercy of slow. He said I kept your recipe card inside a book so I would not lose it in a drawer. He said he had changed phones so many times that the numbers felt like neighbors he waved to but did not know anymore. Except one. He kept one the way you keep a scar. Not to hurt you, but to remember where you learned. Somewhere, a siren drifted by him and then by me like a string pulled between 2 points on a map. The world continued with its own emergencies. The wipers finally found rain and performed their duty with a quiet dignity. He said I am 5 exits away. He said you will see my lights. I said I will be outside. He said no. Stay inside until you see me. You have already stood at enough thresholds for one night. He told me one more thing before the turnoff broke the sound of the road into a series of soft decisions. You do not have to tell me everything tonight. I am not a courthouse. I am a porch. That sentence undid a knot I had not named. The tired ceiling of the life I had lived withstood it without complaint. I stood by the window and watched the wet parking lot collect small versions of the neon letters. The key fob sat on the table like a small blue witness. Down the hall, the radio found a slow song and let it bloom. I realized I was standing taller than I had been an hour earlier. There was no miracle for that, only attention. He said I am turning in now. I heard the indicator nod. The engine note lowered. He said I can see the sign. I said I can see the bend of headlights. He said I am here. I said I know. We did not hang up right away. We let the call hold a moment, as we did not know where to live yet. Then he said Marjorie, and this time my name sounded less like a memory and more like a welcome. I told him I would meet him at the entryway because the rain had earned the right to touch my face. His engine clicked once as he shut it off, and the pattern of the night changed as if someone had moved a piece on a board. I slid the phone into my pocket and took the key from the table. The room breathed out with me. The radio's slow song followed me to the threshold and then politely stayed where it belonged. I stepped into the hall and let the cool air find my skin. Somewhere, a door closed. Somewhere, wipers slept. In the distance, the highway kept speaking in long vowels. I walked toward the stairs and toward lights that were not mine, and toward a voice that had recognized me without asking for proof. Sometimes you do not need to be rescued. You just need to be heard long enough to remember how to open. Hope pulled into the parking lot in a silver car and salt and pepper hair. Headlights stretched across wet pavement and folded themselves under my feet. I stepped out from the stairwell and into the soft rain and saw him in the driver's seat, turning off the engine with a motion my memory recognized before my eyes decided to trust it. Thomas opened his door and stood for a moment, not rushing toward me, letting the night introduce us. The rain polished his shoulders and made small rivers at the corners of his jaw. He looked steady and alive, not young, not old, only whole. "You look like a story that refused to end," he said, and the words warmed the space between us as if he had cupped them in both hands. I answered without planning to, "And you look like the chapter I never finished." The sentence left my mouth with the relief of a window finally opened. We did not embrace. We let recognition move the way water finds a path. He took my suitcase as if it were something that mattered and set it gently in the back seat. The car smelled faintly of cedar and clean leather and a trace of coffee that belonged to early mornings, not emergencies. He walked me to the passenger side and waited as I settled in. He closed the door with care as if he knew I needed to hear the latch say, "You are inside now." In the quiet before the wipers remembered their task, I watched the silver lines of rain drift down the windshield and turn the neon into a watercolor. He glanced at me without staring. "Ready?" he asked. "Ready enough?" I said. He started the car. The radio lit up like a small city and then hushed itself. Tires eased us out of the rectangle of light and into the dark ribbon that led away from the place that had loaned me a bed. We drove the first mile without filling it with anything unnecessary. The world kept its slow machinery in motion. Stoplights changed for no one. A late bus stopped at a corner. He rested one hand at the bottom of the wheel, the way he always had when he wanted to go far without hurrying. When he finally spoke, it was to make room for breathing. "I almost brought flowers," he said. "Then I thought your hands have carried enough today." I watched the road and the shape of his knuckles and understood that kindness can be learned and then polished by time. He asked if the air was too cool. I said it was perfect. He asked if the seat felt right. I said it did. He asked if I was hungry, and I told him hunger would return when my heart believed it had permission. He smiled at that and then tried not to show it. The wipers found their rhythm. Buildings slid past in wet reflections. He said, "I am taking the coastal road. It is quieter." I said, "Quieter sounds like a plan." Silence followed us like a dog that means no harm. He told me something simple. When I cannot sleep, I leave the porch light on. I started doing it years ago without deciding. Some nights it is for no one. Some nights it is for a name I do not say out loud. I looked at him, and then at the road and back at him. A porch light is such a small thing. It is also a language. I said that without looking away from the rain. He nodded, a little motion, like a man who has found the word he was missing. He said, "There is something I have kept, and if I do not tell you now, it will feel like I am trying to hide a kindness, and kindness should not be hidden. I kept your photograph in my office through every renovation, through every change of paint and cloth and glass." People thought she was a muse. I said yes. The truth was, she was a promise to myself that I would not become a man who forgot what it felt like to be certain. I let that sit between us like a warm cup on a cold table. The road bent, and the sea lifted its voice beyond the guardrail, and then let it fall back to its own business. I pictured that office, the measured light, the neat stacks, the picture frame that outlasted trends. I pictured my younger face standing its quiet ground in a room where decisions were made. The idea that I had been allowed to witness his days without asking for entry cracked something hard and careful inside my chest. Why, I asked? Not the dramatic why of a courtroom, but the small one people use when they want the other person to be honest for both of them. He glanced at me again. Because a man should remember the moment he became the kind of person he wanted to be, not the kind of person people told him to be. You were the moment for me, not because we ended with a ceremony, but because we did not. The space kept its shape. A photograph can be a bearing when the weather changes. I looked out at the wash of lights on black water and felt steadier than I had since the sky turned orange. My life had been measured by chores, by appointments, by anniversaries that asked for cake. He was offering a measurement that counted different things. I found my hands resting open on my knees, as if they had finally set down a weight I had been pretending to carry with pride. We drove past neighborhoods that had folded themselves for the night. Some windows glowed with television blue. Some showed nothing but the clean square of a blind. In one yard, a swing moved on its own. "You are quiet," he said, and did not turn it into concern. I told him the quiet felt like a quilt someone had remembered to shake out and lay over my shoulders. He said, "Then let us not disturb it unless it asks." The rain thinned as if it had finished the part of the work that belonged to water. He slowed before a turn I had not seen, and the road gave way to a lane lined with river oaks. The car climbed over the small roots that had lifted the asphalt into gentle ridges. Ahead, a house waited with that particular calm some houses have when they are used to being lived in by a man who closes books before he leaves the room. On the front, above a wide step, a single light was on. Not bright, not showy. A quiet circle on pale wood. He said, "I leave it for lost keys and less tangible things." I said, "It looks like someone is expected." He said, "I suppose that is the point." He pulled into the drive and let the engine finish its thought before he turned the key. The rain gave one last patter on the hood and then surrendered to drizzle. We stayed seated for a moment, not because we were afraid to move, but because stillness had a job and it was doing it well. He looked at me without asking, and I nodded. He came around to my side and opened the door and offered his hand. I took it and stepped onto the mat and felt the ground say, "You can trust this." He retrieved the suitcase and set it near the step. We stood under the light, and I could see the small insects writing invisible poems in the warm air. The porch smelled faintly of wood that had remembered summer. He said, "There is soup on the stove and bread that is good even when it should not be. If you can manage 2 spoonfuls, that will be enough for tonight. If not, then we will let soup be a promise and keep it." I said I can try. He smiled in that small way that had survived decades. He reached for the handle and stopped. Not for dramatic effect, but out of respect for thresholds. He looked at me. "This light stays on," he said, "as long as we need it to." I thanked him, and the thank you felt like a key. We crossed into a hush that was not empty. The floor gave a soft sound under my soles. Somewhere, a clock kept a truthful beat. He set the suitcase by a bench, and I placed my purse on a low table, and for the first time since the sirens, I did not feel the urge to hold on to it. He guided me toward the kitchen without touching my arm. The air was warm with thyme and something buttery. He ladled soup into a bowl and slid it toward me, and it was the simplest ceremony I have known. I took 2 spoonfuls and then 3. He ate nothing, which in its way was a kind of eating. He listened. He let the quiet do what quiet can do when nobody is filling it with noise. When we were done with the effort of that small meal, he washed the bowl as if water were an instrument that could play an old tune, and he wanted me to hear it. He left it upside down on the rack and turned off the kitchen light. We returned to the porch for 1 minute and stood again inside the circle of the lamp. The parking lot light from the place I had left would be shrinking now in the rearview mirror of a night that no longer required me to live inside it. He locked the front, not to keep anyone out, but to tell the house it could rest. The car door had closed earlier with the exact sound a heart makes when it chooses. The walkway lamp at the far edge of the property faded behind us as we stepped farther in. The porch light stayed. It did not brag. It did not blink. It kept watch the way old friends keep watch, without asking for anything in return. His home did not whisper luxury. It whispered peace. The hallway greeted us with the soft breath of beeswax and old wood that had learned patience. A clock somewhere deeper in the house kept time without insisting on attention. The floor gave a quiet answer under my steps, as if it had been trained to listen before it judged. He set my suitcase by a bench and let the house do the rest of the talking. Lamps wore warm shades that made islands of light. Books stood shoulder to shoulder, but not as decoration. A woven throw waited on the back of a chair like an offered hand. He showed me the guest room without ceremony. There was a window that held a square of darkness and the suggestion of trees. The bed looked like it preferred quiet sleepers. The quilt had the washed color of a sky that knows dawn is not far. On the dresser sat a small bowl of smooth stones, each the size of a thumb, each different enough to suggest he picked them up one by one for reasons he did not need to explain. He said, "If you cannot sleep, do not be polite on my behalf. Turn on the light, make tea, wander. This house knows how to keep company." I slept in thin pockets and woke before the clock reached any proud number. Morning pressed a pale wash through the curtains. Somewhere, a kettle made a single syllable and then waited. I sat up and felt my spine remember that beds can be kind. When I stepped into the hallway, the air met me with the mild scent of toast and thyme. I followed it until the kitchen opened like a scene that had been rehearsed so many times it had learned how to be natural. He stood at the stove reading a note card and stirring with the other hand as if breakfast were a paragraph he wanted to get right. He looked up and smiled the small, honest smile I recognized from years ago when he solved something without needing applause. "Good morning," he said without adding anything heavy to the greeting. He set a mug near the end of the counter, black coffee again. He remembered and did not make a fuss about remembering. We ate in a comfortable, quiet place, the kind that does not ask you to perform. Toast broke with a sound that seemed larger than it was. Butter softened and made its way where it needed to go. When words arrived, they came like small birds, one at a time, light enough not to startle the day. He asked if the pillow worked. I said it did not argue with my neck. He said good and then let good be enough. After dishes that needed only a rinse, he said, "Come, there is something you should see." He led me down a short corridor where the boards grew lighter and the air took on a faint note of lemon from a bowl of yellow fruit under a window. We stopped before a painting that caught the light without hoarding it. A woman in a garden full of soft greens and fog stood with her shoulder turned toward the viewer. Her dress was a modest blue. The line of her neck carried a kind of resolve I had always hoped I bore without asking for it. I knew that posture. It was a photograph someone had once taken of me near an old camellia in a different city, a different year. I felt a heat at the back of my eyes, and I let it be warmth, not shame. "So you were the flowers," I said, and the words came before the question could ask for permission. He nodded without triumph. "And you were the reason," he said, and the line did not perform. It just sat down in the room and made itself useful. I studied the brushwork, the way the painter had understood restraint, and given it dignity. The mist did not hide the subject. It honored her privacy. "Where did you get this?" I asked. He said a friend had seen the photograph and sent it to him years ago, with a note that said she looks like Clarity. He had let the painting keep him honest. On days when decisions tried to turn him into someone louder than he wanted to be, he stood in front of this wall and remembered why quiet sometimes wins. We moved past the frame into a small study that looked toward the river. On the desk stood a vase with stems long since given up on color. The dried blooms kept their shape as if holding a memory for someone who needed to borrow it. He touched the rim with 2 fingers, not to arrange, just to greet. He said, "There is something else." He pulled open a shallow drawer and lifted a small bundle of cards tied with a faded ribbon. The ribbon had that old courage certain fabrics keep if they have held the same job for a long time. He set the bundle on the desk and loosened the knot. Cards slid out with the sound pressed paper makes, not quite a rustle, more like agreement. I recognized them in a way that made my breath jump. Florist notes. Not the notes I had kept, because there had never been any. For 10 years, a small bouquet had appeared at my door every birthday with no card, no handwriting, only the arrangement itself and the calendar to name the day. After Robert died, the first came when I had decided no one would remember. The second came when I insisted the first had been a mistake. They kept arriving like a promise that refused to ask for credit. He placed one card where I could see the printed words. Delivery confirmation. The date was mine. The address was my old address. The sender line said private account. He did not speak, and I did not rush the silence. The river light shifted on the floorboards. Somewhere the kettle decided that the second syllable could wait. "Why did you never sign them?" I asked. He lifted his shoulder a fraction and let it fall. "Because love that asks to be thanked is not the kind I wanted to practice," he said. "Because grief can be shy, and I did not want to crowd it. Because I needed to do one useful thing for you each year, even if usefulness was only a small vase that said someone still knows your day by heart." He paused, as if checking the sentence for extra words and removing them. "Also," he said, "I never wanted to make trouble between you and a life you had chosen without me. Anonymous was a way to be near without crossing a line. I thought of those mornings. The soft knock that did not insist. Mrs. Doyle said there is a package at your step, and winked as if the world had remembered its manners. I thought of the small thrill and the small worry, the way I put the blooms on the kitchen table and let them sit beside a pie I would not eat and a chair I would not fill. I had wanted to ask someone who, but I also wanted to keep the mystery intact because certain doors open best without a key. Now the answer stood here with an untied ribbon and steady hands. I sat at the edge of a leather chair that had been kind to many visitors. The painting in the hall held its blue. The dried bouquet kept its shadow. He did not reach for me. He let the house carry the weight of the moment, which it did as if trained for this exact duty. I whispered a simple thank you, and he accepted it with a small nod that protected us both from sentimentality. "We are not young," he said, "so there is no need to pretend the heart forgets on command." He asked if I would like to walk in the garden. The sky wore a cloud cover that made the greens richer. We stepped outside, and the porch light, still on from habit, spent itself gently against day. The path was lined with herbs that released their scents when our sleeves brushed them. Gravel crunched under our shoes. Bees worked without commentary. He showed me a corner where he started seedlings and a bench that faced a piece of the river that did not care to be photographed. I listened to the garden. It had learned his pace. We came back inside through a side door, and the house closed around us with that quiet authority certain places have. He asked if music would help the air settle. I said yes, even before I knew what song he would choose. He lifted the fallboard of a piano that wore its years with dignity. The first notes were not a performance. They were in a conversation with the room. He played something slow that he had learned how to hold sorrow without squeezing it, the kind of piece that leaves space between phrases so the listener can step through without tripping. I stood in the doorway and let the sound wash the edges where my night still clung. On the desk, the bundle of florist cards rested near the vase of dried blooms. The paper and the petals shared a patience as the melody rose and fell. I watched the way his hands moved, not showing off, finding what mattered, and staying there. The painting in the hall caught a little of the music and seemed to deepen as if the woman in the blue dress had heard and approved. When he finished, he did not ask if it helped. He let the question remain unsaid so the answer could be honest. I breathed deeper than I had in days. The room agreed. He closed the piano as gently as he had closed the car door the night before. The subtle click marked the end of one thing and the beginning of another. I looked at the dried flowers and listened as the last note settled into the wood. Somewhere beyond the window, the wind turned a leaf and set it back down. The house listened, and so did I, and in that shared attention, something inside me remembered how to be whole. The rain did not drown our words. It baptized them. It began as a soft ticking against the leaves, a rehearsal more than a performance. The sky had folded itself into a gray that made the greens of the garden deepen, as if color had been sleeping and finally woke. Thomas opened the side window and let the air in. It carried the scent of wet rosemary, a little earth, a hint of river. We stood for a moment without speaking, listening to the first drops decide their rhythm. He picked up 2 old jackets from a peg, handed one to me, and nodded toward the path. We walked slowly along the gravel that crunched under our shoes. The bench beneath the fig tree had held other conversations and knew how to be patient. We sat with a decent space between us, the kind that leaves room for truth to arrive without tripping. Rain beaded on the sleeve of my jacket and gathered at the hem before letting go. I let my hands rest open on my knees. I could feel, for the first time in days, that my breathing had learned to move all the way down and back up again. He asked if I was warm enough. I told him the air felt like it was made for thinking slowly. The rain thickened. The umbrella leaned against the bench leg, but neither of us reached for it. There are moments when shelter is not a roof, but the act of staying present. I began with the smaller stones. How familiar quiet can be when it lives in a kitchen where someone is expected. How strange it can be when it sits across from you and asks you to be less than you are. I said I was tired from holding myself together in rooms that were too clean for grief. He listened with the same attention he gives to music, not collecting solutions, only offering a steady place for the words to land. He asked about Ethan in the way a man asks about a history that is not his to revise. I told him what a good boy he had been with rocks in his pockets and questions for the moon. I told him how adulthood sometimes reshapes tenderness into something that calls itself management. I did not make a villain of my son. I let the rain carry away what was not useful. He said my name, not to begin a lecture, but to ask for permission to place something on the bench between us. I said yes with my eyes. He drew a breath and let it out like a man about to step into cold water. I came, he said, and the words were so quiet the garden bent closer. I came to Robert's service. I stood at the back by the magnolia. I kept my hands in my pockets because I did not know what to do. I just did not know if I had the right. For a heartbeat, the rain was louder than anything human. I looked at him and saw a younger man in a dark suit, the kind of suit men own for weddings and loss, standing beneath a tree, not to hide, but to make himself smaller than my sorrow. I felt the firm earth under my shoes and imagined the church steps and the familiar faces and the blur of casseroles afterward. I had not known. I had thought grief was a private room I had locked without noticing. It turns out the garden outside it was full of witnesses who loved me without making announcements. Maybe love does not ask for permission, I said. Maybe it shows up and waits where it will not block the aisle. He closed his eyes as if a long-held muscle had finally released. He told me he had left before anyone could turn and see him, because he did not want the day to become complicated with history. He said he had gone home and sat in the dark, and made no calls. He had made tea. He had listened to the kettle cool. He had walked the garden because walking had always been his way of thinking without puncturing the thought. He said he had promised himself quietly to keep a porch light habit he had already started by accident. Rain gathered at the edge of the fig leaf and fell in a single perfect drop onto the stone path. I found I could breathe more easily, knowing he had been near when I thought no one was. Relief has a shape different from joy. It is lighter and heavier at once, like laying down a box you have carried too far. I told him what I had not told anyone, that the years after Robert were made of other people's careful voices and my own rehearsed competence. How competence can be a polite way to disappear. How birthdays kept arriving with a small arrangement at the door, and how those flowers had made me suspicious of goodness for 1 hour and grateful for the rest of the week. He smiled at that and said suspicion can be a training wheel for gratitude if you let it go at the right corner. The rain found its surety. It made a soft music on the fig leaves and a brisker rhythm on the group of terracotta pots by the path. I watched 2 snails make unhurried decisions near the time. The world for once agreed that the pace should be human. "Tell me the thing you are afraid to say," he said, and he said it without leaning. I stared at the place where water gathered in the dip of the stone. I said I am afraid that if I step fully into this piece, something will take it from me as proof that I did not earn it. He did not answer with reassurance. He said, "Then let us practice." We sat still and let peace be a practice, not a prize. He told me about failing kindly at a few things that mattered and still finding his way forward. He told me the year he thought ambition would save him and how it did not. He told me about a January morning when he gave a bonus to a junior architect whose idea had rescued a project he had been too proud to question. He said he had written a thank you note afterward and kept a carbon copy to remind himself that gratitude is a muscle, not a mood. I laughed, and the sound felt strange in the best way, as if it belonged to a world I had not visited in too long. He looked relieved. He told me he loved the garden in this weather because it stopped pretending to be pretty and simply did its work. I understood more than he knew. Beauty without labor is decoration. I had been decorated for years as a mother and neighbor and volunteer. The labor of becoming myself again would be quiet and honest and slow. A sudden, heavier burst of rain sent us under the small overhang by the tool shed. The scent of clean metal and cut cedar stayed there like a polite guest. He reached for a towel to brush the water from my jacket sleeve. I stepped back half an inch, and then forward again. Not out of fear, but because after so much hunger, a woman can forget how to accept a simple gift. He understood my delay and waited until I nodded. The gesture was ordinary and reverent at the same time. He said the sentence I had needed long before I knew it existed. You do not have to be brave every minute. Allowing yourself to be held by a day like this is also a kind of courage. I let the towel rest on my sleeve, and the water darkens it, and then lightens again. When the rain eased from sermon to lullaby, we walked back toward the house. The path had learned our steps and did not protest. The fig leaves released their last gathered drops like reluctant goodbyes. On the porch, the mat caught our weight and kept it without complaint. Inside, the study still held the quiet of the morning. The painting in the hall stood watch without asking to be looked at. He poured hot water over leaves in a small pot, and the steam rose with the faintest hint of mint. We sat in the room that knew when not to speak. He said, I am sorry for the part of your loneliness that was mine to alleviate, and I did not. I said, I forgive you for the part that was not yours, and you tried to carry on anyway. We did not shake hands on it. We let the tea steam seal the promise. By the time the cups were empty, the sound on the roof had changed to a soft tapping that could have been the house remembering a story. We did not rush to fill the new quiet. Night drew its curtain gently. I felt the wet calm in my bones and knew it would hold until morning. Somewhere beyond the trees, the river turned in its sleep. When I woke later, light had softened into the pale gray that belongs to the hour before day is sure of itself. The rain had thinned to a few friendly notes in the gutter. I lay still and listened. Then, from the garden, a bird offered a single clear thread of song. Another answered from farther off. The house gathered the sound and sent it down the hallway. I closed my eyes and let the birds braid the night to the day. Forgiveness had not arrived like a courier. It had grown like moss, quietly, while we kept watch in the rain. Regret always arrives politely, and always too late. I heard the latch at the front gate click against the post and knew it was Ethan before I saw him. The afternoon had the clean light that comes after rain. The garden smelled of mint and damp stone. I wiped my hands on a towel and stepped onto the porch. He was standing on the top step, not crossing the threshold, one foot on wood and one on air, as if balance could be negotiated there. He said hello without a smile. His eyes did a quick inventory of the house and came back to me. He held himself like a man who had rehearsed every sentence and was trying to remember which came first. Thomas stayed inside, visible in the window with a book closed in his lap, giving us space without withdrawing it. Mom, we were wrong. No, I said. You were honest then. This is you being uncomfortable now. He flinched like the word had found a bruise. He looked down at the step and scuffed it with the edge of his shoe. He told me he had been thinking since the meeting. He said he had spoken to friends, to a colleague who lives near the river road. He said people talk. He said he knew who Thomas was now. He said the house, the company, and the history. He said it kindly, as if the facts might put a balm on something they had just opened. I let that rest in the air. The bees worked the lavender and ignored us. A blue jay scolded the world from the oak and then decided it had better business elsewhere. He tried again. He said we should discuss protections. He said transitions can be confusing. He said the word estate and then swallowed it. He used the word future twice in one sentence. He said he wanted to make sure I was safe. I listened the way a person listens for a distant train. My heartbeat did not change. I asked who had told him what. He named a neighbor of a friend who had seen my face at a market near here, the kind of place where the cashier knows the names of herbs without looking at the tags. He mentioned a client who had pointed at a photograph in a magazine article about architecture done with conscience. He said I looked good. He said I looked at home. I said perhaps I do. He said he was sorry for how the other day had gone. He said he had not meant to push. He said he had wanted to help and did not know how. He looked at his hands as if they had acted without orders. I told him I knew the shape of good intentions. I told him I also knew the difference between care and custody. He nodded, and the motion was honest. Then his gaze slipped past my shoulder and measured the porch light, the quiet paint, the line of windows. I knew that look. It belonged to a boy who had learned early to count and file and plan. It had been useful to him. It could also be unkind. He asked if we could talk inside. I said we would stay out here for now, where the breeze could keep the temperature honest. He shifted his weight, and the step answered with a small sound that told me it had held many awkward conversations and had learned to survive them. "Mom, can you hear me out? We could make a plan. Maybe you can come stay with us for a while and see how it feels. Clara thinks we started on the wrong foot. We could reset." "Reset is a polite word for undo," I said. "Undo lives in the past. The past is a country I cannot enter without a visa issued by sleep. I am standing here." He tried a different angle. He told me he had looked up Thomas and that the search results were impressive. He said sometimes men with that kind of profile have complicated personal lives, and he paused there, waiting for me to fill in the shape he had drawn. I let the silence stay empty. He added that he wanted to meet Thomas properly, man to man. He said he did not want me to be hurt. I said Thomas is inside. He could come out. Ethan glanced at the window and then away. He said another day, when schedules were clearer. I watched the refusal pass through him even as the request left his mouth. The old habit of control had arrived dressed as courtesy. He took a breath and tried the line that had worked on admissions, committees, and lenders, and people who opened doors for him all his life. "Mom, we were wrong. Let us fix this." I shook my head. "You cannot fix what you did not break. You can only put your hands in your pockets and walk beside me while I choose." He looked pained. I softened nothing. Love can be a soft thing. Love can also be a spine. He asked if I would at least consider returning to the old neighborhood when things settled. I said the house there had become ash and air and a cautionary tale. I said my address now was a place with a gate that clicked and a path that knew my weight. He had to hear the truth that even if he did not like the grammar, he tried tenderness. He said I was his mother. He said he missed me. He said he had been looking through boxes and found the drawing he made when he was small, a red entry with 4 panes and a woman waving. The edges of the paper had curled. He said he kept it on his desk that morning, and it made him sad. I felt that. I let it in. I told him I missed him too. Then I told him that missing is not a strategy. We could meet for coffee on Tuesdays. We could walk by the river on Saturdays when the weather did not argue. We could begin again in ways that asked nothing from the other person but presence. He blinked in a way that meant he was not sure if this was a concession or a boundary. That uncertainty was good for him. It could teach us both. He said Clara would want to come. I said then, "Actually listen when she does." He winced, and we both knew why. Thomas opened the front window an inch, and the cool air carried the scent of black tea. He did not step out. He set 2 glasses of water on a small table and closed the window again. The gesture was exact. He made a place for what was needed and left the rest to us. Ethan picked up 1 glass and did not drink. He stared across the yard at the low fence and the small gate that met the road. He said it was a pretty threshold. He said the word pretty like it had forgotten its job. He asked if I was happy. "Happiness is a loud word," I said. "Peace is quieter, and I can hear it when I wake up. I am learning its language." He swallowed, and his throat made a sound I had not heard since he was 12, and trying not to cry about something that did not deserve his tears. I stepped down 1 step so we were at nearly the same height. I told him I would not throw the past at him. I told him I would not keep his mistake in a jar. I told him I would ask him to do something harder. "Watch me choose this life, and do not call it fragile just because you did not choose it for me." He stared at the gate. At last, he said he would call in 2 days. He said he would bring no papers. He said if we met for coffee, I could pick the place. The sentences landed one by one like stones aligned to make a path. "That will do," I said. He set the untouched water back on the table and stepped down to the walkway. He turned once as if there was a final thing that might save the scene. No saviors came. He lifted his hand. I lifted mine. We were two people on either side of a line, not enemies, just learning new geography. I walked with him to the gate. The street wore its Sunday quiet, though it was not Sunday. The hedge held onto a few stray drops of the morning. He stood in the opening and did not cross it for a heartbeat. He looked older than last week and younger than next year. He said, "Take care, Mom." I said, "Take care, Ethan." He stepped through. I closed the gate with a small push. The hinge gave a soft sigh, and the sound folded into the wind that had just started moving through the trees. For a moment, the world lined up. The gravel remembered our feet. The air remembered rain. Behind me, the porch held its light as a habit, not a hope. Not every apology comes to mend. Some arrive to mark the place where you no longer need mending. I stood on the path and felt the steadiness of my own choices. The wind stroked the hedge. The hinge finished its song. And in that simple music, I knew I had not only survived the week, I had crossed a threshold and left it gently closed behind me. The ashes fed the soil. We planted what the fire left behind. Morning opened with a thin wash of light and a quiet that felt earned. Thomas carried a burlap-wrapped camellia to the garden, a young shrub with glossy leaves that kept their dignity even in pale Sunday. I followed with a small tin I had not touched since the day we visited the lot where my life had turned to powder. I had taken a scoop then, not to worship ruin, but to give the past a way to keep speaking without shouting. The ground was soft from the rain. He set the camellia near the fig and handed me the trowel. We knelt on old cushions that remembered other knees. The earth gave gently. Worms folded back into shadow. I pressed my palm to the soil and felt it accept what came next. He opened a bag of compost that smelled like work done well. I tipped a pinch of gray from the tin, not much, just enough to say the old house would learn a new language. We mixed it in with careful hands until the colors were no longer separate. We lowered the root ball and let it sit. He held the shrub steady while I backfilled the hole. Our fingers found a rhythm. Soil fell. Air escaped in small sighs. I thought of all the years I had kept any softness hidden under competence, and how the ground itself had more faith than I did. We mounded a small circle to catch water and pressed the edge with our palms like sealing a promise. He carried the watering can and tipped a slow stream. The dark ring held. We did not hurry to stand. Knees resting against the earth, we watched the leaves reflect a little sky. A bee made a gentle inventory of rosemary and moved on. The river beyond the trees turned a page quietly. He brushed dirt from his hands and let it fall back where it belonged. I told him the tin had felt heavy in my purse that day at the lot. I told him I was surprised to feel relief instead of superstition when I gathered the ash. He nodded the way he does when words have already met him halfway. He said becoming is sometimes a slow verb dressed as a plant. I laughed at that, and the sound fit the yard. He rose and offered a hand. When we stood, he reached into his jacket and brought out a small linen pouch, the kind jewelers use when boxes feel too certain. He turned it in his palm once, as if asking himself for one last witness, and then placed it in my hand. No ceremony, no clearing of throats, just a gift with gentle weight. My fingers found the drawstring. Inside lay a thin band, simple and bright, the color of sunlight deciding on a doorstep. My breath caught in the old way, and steadied in the new one. He watched my face, not the ring. "Before you say anything," he said softly, "let me tell you where it came from." After the site was cleared, I asked a recovery crew to sift the area where your dresser would have been. He lifted his shoulder the smallest amount, not to dramatize, but to be exact. They found a lump of metal fused to what had once been a brooch. Gold remembers. A friend in town refined it and pressed it into this shape, something beautiful from what tried to destroy you. I held the band between thumb and forefinger. It was lighter than I expected and heavier than a trinket. "Then maybe that is what love really is," I said, and my voice did not shake. Not the rescue, but the remaking. He did not try to place it on my finger. He let me decide where it belonged. I slid it onto my right hand, the finger that writes lists and edits memories and reaches for doorknobs. It settled there as if the day had been measured for it. No parade, no speech. Just a small gold circle that tied yesterday to a place it could not hurt me. We stood again in our quiet yard. He traced the air above the camellia with a gardener's foresight, showing me where branches would thicken and how shade would fall in winter when petals dared to open while the rest of the garden hesitated. I pictured a bloom against cold air, petals like careful sentences, color where color did not need permission. I told him about the first camellia I loved, the one in a stranger's yard where someone once took my picture without asking me to smile. He pointed toward the hallway where that image had been turned into paint and patience. He said the garden would like this echo. We walked the path in slow loops. The gravel agreed with each step. I looked down at my hands, soil still in the lines, gold catching small pieces of Sunday. There was no triumph in the scene, only a steadiness I had not known how to ask for when I was younger. Loss had done its loud work. Now, gentler hands could take over. He asked if I wanted tea or water. I said water first, then tea if the kettle felt like singing. In the kitchen, he filled 2 glasses, and we drank standing by the sink like workers taking a break. Neither had to justify. Through the window, the camellia was a small thought with a long plan. I touched the band again, not to check its reality, but to consider its promise. It did not erase anything. It did not need to. Back outside, we laid a flat stone at the edge of the small ring of soil. I pressed letters into it with a stick while the clay was soft. Not a date or a quote, just a single word that I had learned to be honest. Starting. We set the stone at a slight angle so rain would not sit and invite moss before its time. Thomas brushed dirt from his sleeve with a motion I had seen 1,000 times in the way he did any job he cared about. He looked at me with that steady gaze that does not perform. He did not ask if I was all right. He trusts me to say it when I am not. I nodded toward the plant, and he understood the movement. The house behind us held its breath in the right way, making space and keeping watch. We walked to the spigot and rinsed our hands. The water ran brown for a moment, and then clear. He dried his hands on his jeans and handed me a towel from the hook. The ring flashed once and went quiet. He smiled without showing teeth, and I returned it because we were 2 adults who had learned how to put joy on a table without worrying it would spill. In the late light, the yard shifted into its evening arrangement. Shadows lengthened and met at corners that had not existed at noon. The air cooled. The world seemed to say, "You have done enough for one day." We sat for a few minutes and looked at what we had done. Not much by someone else's calendar. Everything by mine. I thought of the week behind me, and of all the rooms I had entered with my shoulders lifted. I let them lower. I thought of Ethan at the gate, and the way he had begun to learn a new geography. I wished him patience, and I wished myself the same. I thought of the ring's journey, from heat and ruin to a circle that asked for nothing but wear. I closed my hand and opened it again. There it was, simple as a good word. When the wind lifted, it came from the river and carried cool across our cheeks. A leaf turned and settled. Somewhere, a late bird offered a brief line of song as if to sign the day. We stood. He took the empty watering can to refill for the morning. I brushed soil from my knees and pressed a palm to the mound one last time, feeling its give, its quiet hunger for rain. We went inside when the porch light found its job again. The kettle sang once, the patient note of another small ceremony. Before the door closed, I looked back toward the garden. The camellia held its place, a small green vow under a wide sky. In the clear air, the sapling trembled just enough to prove it was alive. At sunrise, my coffee did not taste like revenge. It tasted like peace. Light moved across the table as if it had been rehearsing all night. The steam curled and disappeared and returned, a quiet lesson in staying. The house held its breath in a way that made room for mine. Beyond the window, the camellia stood like a small vow with wet leaves catching the first gold. Somewhere in the garden, a bird began with one clean note, and then trusted itself to sing another. I wrapped both hands around the mug. Heat pooled against my palms and traveled up my wrists. The ring on my right hand gathered a small circle of mourning and let it go. In the hallway, the painting of a younger me in a misted garden borrowed the new light and gave it back softer. Sometimes I look up and think she is waiting for me to finish a sentence I began decades ago. Today, it felt like she was listening while I did. Thomas moved lightly in the kitchen, the way someone moves when they know exactly where everything belongs. The kettle had already sung and gone quiet. He did not ask me how I slept. He trusts that I will say it if I did not. He rinsed a second cup and set it to dry without hurry. The house hummed in its low, steady way, floorboards easing, clock keeping an honest tempo. Nothing pressed, Nothing fled. I thought about the long week that had delivered me to this chair. There had been a night that turned the sky the color of a warning, a red entry that asked me to be smaller than the woman who had built it, a room with a thin blanket and a radio that remembered old melodies, a phone call that felt like a window opening by itself, rain that did something to my bones I do not have a name for, a gate that clicked and held. A small green thing was planted where something gray had asked to be remembered in a better shape. It had been a short time and also a whole lifetime. He stepped into the doorway with a simple plate, toast, and a little fruit arranged in a way that did not call attention to itself. He placed it near my hand and did not insist. He said good morning, and I answered that the morning seemed determined to be exactly that. He smiled with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose habits are proving themselves useful. We ate without ceremony. Toast broke, butter softened, the knife laid down its shine. When I had finished, he took the plate and returned with a clean cloth and swept a few crumbs into his palm. He did not carry them away quickly. He stood for a moment, the cloth in one hand, the other empty, eyes on the window, and whatever the day might be asking. Then he did the kindest extravagant thing a person can do. He poured a second cup and placed it beside mine. Not across. Not opposite. Beside. 2 circles of steam rose and threaded into one shape before they vanished into ordinary air. He did not speak. He did not reach for my hand. He did not perform the meaning. He let it rest on the table where I could recognize it with the part of me that had finally learned to listen. I thought of days when I had wanted a speech, an oath, a gesture large enough to make up for years I had spent building competence like a wall around myself. Now the small weight of a warm cup added itself to the morning, and the message did not need to grow louder. It was enough. He was asking me to choose alongside him, not to be carried. He was telling me that home could be a verb that 2 people practiced every morning until it did not require effort. I placed my hand flat on the table between the cups. He mirrored me. Our fingertips did not meet. They did not need to. The distance was courteous, the intention unmistakable. He said, "I have nothing to add that would make this truer." I nodded because he did not ask for language, and yet the right words arrived anyway. Sometimes, the fire is not punishment, it is an invitation. I heard myself say it, not for the drama of it, but because the sentence finally belonged to me. The light warmed the wood. The bird in the garden worked on a longer phrase and found it. The air tasted like coffee and was clean. My body, which has so often been drafted into service as evidence, proof, or performance, sat still and simply lived. I thought of Ethan and the way he had stood at the top step yesterday, not crossing into shade or sun, a man learning the map of his mother. We will walk by the river on Tuesday and call it practice. Clara will come and I will listen, and then I will ask them both to listen back. Peace does not have to be fragile to be quiet. Thomas said we could drive to the market later if I wanted fresh herbs. He said the woman at the stall near the end keeps thyme in clay pots just wide enough for my windowsill. He said we could plant another shrub before the weather turns. He said he had found an old chair in a shop that can be brought back to life without sanding away its history. He spoke like a person making plans for the day, not against it. I picked up the second cup and held it close to the first, rims almost touching. The steam braided again, brief and perfect. My yes did not need to be a word. It was this, the simple placing of 2 ordinary things in the same pool of light. He saw it, and his shoulders lowered the small degree that says a man has set down a load he meant to carry without sharing. We sat a while and let the kitchen be what kitchens have always promised to be for those who use them with care. A room where hunger is met, and no one asks you to be better than yourself. He lifted his cup, and I lifted mine, and the porcelain sounded a tiny note that might have been applause if anyone were foolish enough to clap for quiet. People speak about closure as if lives are books you can shut with clean hands. I do not want that. What I have wanted and what I am getting is a page that will still take ink in the right weather. We will keep planting, we will keep trimming, we will let the porch light do its old job at dusk, not as a signal of worry but as a habit of welcome. When I pass the painting in the hall, I will nod to the young woman in blue and say, "We made it here." He asked if I would like to see the river shine before it gets too bright for it. I said yes, and we stepped onto the porch. The air had that first warmth that means the day will be kind. The gate clicked when I brushed it with my fingertips, just enough to let the hinges creak. The path remembered our feet. The camellia leaned an inch into the light, a student willing to learn. We walked toward the water with cups in hand and no need to rush. The river gave us a strip of silver and took it back, generous and particular. A heron stood near the reeds and pretended not to mind us. He said nothing more about promises. I said nothing more about endurance. We let the surface carry what it carried. When we turned back, the house met us the way it had when I first stepped across its threshold, not with spectacle but with the steadiness of something made to last. The 2 cups left a twin circle on the table, faint marks that would fade by noon, and I decided to be glad for the time they would take to disappear. That is how peace behaves. It leaves a trace and trusts you to remember. We did what mornings ask. He rinsed both cups. I opened a window. Air moved through the hall and lifted the corner of a page on the piano. The bird in the garden found a companion and traded phrases. Light climbed the wall and stopped where the frame hung. The woman in the painting kept her posture of quiet resolve, and I kept mine. Before the day got busy with its errands, he set 1 empty cup next to mine again, the gesture repeating itself without fuss, a rehearsal that has finally taken hold. I answered by moving my chair an inch closer to his. We were not staging anything for witnesses, we were letting the room learn our arrangement. There is a way of winning that looks nothing like victory. It looks like breath that does not race. It looks like a mind not trying to outtalk a quiet that has earned the right to stay. It looks like 2 circles of steam rising and vanishing, and yet somehow still warming what they touched. The light at the window deepened. The sound of the birds stitched itself into the hum of the house. I stood and touched the table where the cups had rested, the wood warm where they had been. We had not solved the world. We had not erased a single difficult memory. We had set 2 ordinary cups side by side and let the morning tell us that some vows do not require words. When I finally turned away from the view, the room accepted the small change without remark. The day gathered itself and began. Outside, the camellia held fast in the quiet breeze, leaves trembling just enough to show they were alive. Inside, the last of the steam thinned into the air. The birds kept singing. The light kept going, and in that soft motion, I understood I was home at last. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the playlist now showing on screen.